what are the major chemical differences between cold and hot brew?
There's not so many studies which studied this directly, right? Because cold brew is quite a new drink, and it's not been studied so much. But we can, of course, say some based on fundamental knowledge that we have. We can say what kind of differences are there. So temperature drives the extraction, right? So we can assume first that if compounds that extract harder at slower at high temperatures, this will be even then tougher at low temperatures. So if we have at high temperatures everything extracting very fast and some compounds a bit slower than the others, then if we go to low temperature, these differences will be exponentially higher. So we can expect that some aroma compounds which are harder to extract in hot coffee will be comparably to other compounds even less extracted in the cold brew. So this is one thing. The other thing is the loss of volatiles during the extraction, right? Because you are brewing hot brew and it's flowing out from the, I don't know, from this wherever, from the espresso spout or somewhere where it's flowing, and you have a large surface area to the air, you have evaporation of volatiles. So very high volatile compounds will evaporate very fast in hot brews, whereas in cold brews they won't evaporate so fast. So you will retain some of those highly volatile compounds more in cold brews. And one of them is actually not so nice compound in coffee, which is furan. So this compound could be considered toxic. And in hot brews, while you're waiting your coffee to cool down because you can't drink it hot, and already during brewing, you lose a lot of furan. It evaporates from your brew. And then in the cold brew, you extract all of it in your coffee. So you have higher concentration of furans in the cold brew than in the hot coffee.
That's very interesting.
Do
you have any insights?
Yeah. These are the fundamentals, right? So what we can say about, but we have some studies ongoing actually right now at ZHW, specifically on cold brew and fundamental extraction mechanisms that govern the cold brew extraction.
Actually, do you have any insights on the caffeine content? Because that's a myth in the barista world, that cold brew has a lot more caffeine, and that's why it's much more stimulating.
Much more now. I mean, we're already with hot coffee, you extract pretty much 70–80% of caffeine when you're normally extracting, you know, roughly in this range. And it cannot have much more. You can just have 20–30% more if you really extract everything, you know, but this is more like going to soluble coffee extraction methods, not regular methods. So I would say more, perhaps even like a quickly made cold brew could even have less caffeine, because caffeine is one of those molecules that is a bit harder to extract than most coffee molecules. But of course, if you leave the cold brews brewing a long enough time, you will eventually extract everything in your brew from the grounds.
As you just mentioned, that caffeine is harder to extract. I think that it's going well in line with taste profiles from hot brew and cold brew, because cold brew is most often perceived by people as more balanced, more mild, less bitter, maybe sometimes even more acidic, because, for example, acidic molecules are more polar, so easier to extract, whereas bitter compounds are less polar and harder to extract. The same with the caffeine, which thereof results in a beverage which is tending to be more on the acidic side than on the bitter side, and thereof also like more preferable for most people who like or who don't like bitter coffee. That's just from the taste perspective.
Yeah, with taste perspective, I would also like to point one thing out, that it's not only the composition, it's also the temperature of the beverage that has an impact, right?
Exactly.
So comparing hot filter coffee to cold brew, and then saying, oh, this is a different taste, that it's because of different chemical composition, it's a bit unfair. So if you really want to compare the chemical position with your taste, you need to have the both beverages at the same temperature. So let filter coffee cool down to 40 degrees and heat up the cold brew to 40 degrees and measure the temperature of both, and then compare them, and then really see what is the beverage, I don't know, so it's the extraction method impact on your beverage taste. Because one is that you're drinking it cold, but you know, you drink filter coffee on ice, it also tastes way more acidic and way more refreshing and less bitter than a hot filter coffee.
Yeah.
So it's both effects that are playing here, and you need to kind of distinguish or separate both of them.
Yeah, I think most people also notice this shift in taste. For example, when you make iced coffee, which most people misperceive as iced coffee, is cold brew, which is not, because it's hot brewed coffee and cool down. I think most of our listeners or viewers might know, but most of the people out there, they don't know. And so if you, for example, brew coffee hot and then cool it down, you will have a totally different taste and flavor profile, as you already mentioned previously, than you have if you make really a cold brew coffee. Like the flavor, like what you can smell, is way less complex and well less floral or fruity, and the taste profile shifts very much more towards bitterness and like harsh bitterness, and away from like kind of like balanced and mild taste profile of a cold brew or a hot brew. So yeah, I think the temperature you're tasting the beverage is also quite essential to evaluate the sensory profile of it.
It's very interesting. From a marketing point of view, it's not yet defined what exactly cold brew coffee is. So what you just mentioned is that some people, they brew hot coffee and they immediately cool it down. And in the barista world, we often refer to like flash brew to this. And when we talk, or many people, baristas talk about real cold brew, we are talking about putting water in a full immersion brewing way into the water. And then you have the ground coffee in the water and you will step it for several hours. So that is the barista world, how we would look at what flash brew and what cold brew is.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be any definition. And what you can see now, for example, there is a new launch in Australia as well as in the US from Suntory Boss, and they are talking about flash brew. Then there is also from California a specialty coffee brand called Verve, and they're doing exactly the same. And they're talking about having more flavors, less bitter taste, less harshness in the aftertaste, exactly what you just mentioned. But it looks like this is more like a marketing talk, and we need to go further to define what cold brew really is.
I think it is also a job for the lawmaker, hypothetically speaking. Like coffee per se is protected, even things like espresso or cappuccino is protected, and cold brew. So we had a lot of discussions with Atomo Coffee, cold brew, hot brewed, and then iced, and so on. And during this discussion, it turned out that generally, like global, there's no fixed definition on the one hand, and also on the other hand, I think consumers are not aware of those fine differences often, which is why there's also not a demand, or why people don't claim for a clear definition. I think it's mostly in our like in our field that we think a lot about it and that we discuss it. But for most people, they think, oh, it's a cold coffee, I want to have a cold coffee, and they don't mind how it is brewed. And I think that's the problem, why there's no force driving to a decision, to a protection or something like that. But yeah, especially in the US, if you go to a supermarket shelf and grab out cold brews, there's a lot of, like, they all claim they're cold brew. And even from big specialty coffee producers like Blue Bottle or Stoke or whatsoever. And you don't even know if they're hot brewed and cooled down, or flash brewed, as you mentioned. Same with Worth. And yeah, let's see what the next years bring, because I think that's quite interesting, and also to narrow down and give further specifications.
But does it really matter if it's how is it brewed? I mean, me as a customer, I really care in the end what the taste is like. If you can if you make from one coffee better coffee, if you brew it cold and drink it cold, and from another type of coffee, you perhaps it's just better when you brew it hot and then you cool it down and you drink it iced. In the end, for me, it's kind of also a matter of well, it's a cold drink, right? But for me personally, I would not mind if it's prepared one way or another. What I mind in the end is what I taste.
Yeah, I think it is also a good point what you just mentioned. If you have different roast degrees and grinding sizes, you can apply different brewing methods, and both might result, when cooled down, in a similar taste experience, or not in a similar taste experience, but in a well-perceived taste experience, or like both might be yummy, just because grinding size and or roasting degree is different. Yeah, so maybe that is also a reason why it is so hard to define cold brew, because like the consumer experience in the end might be still delightful no matter what. Yeah,
I guess there's also the question of
cold brew.
I had one.
Did you ever had a? Yeah, you had one.
Yeah, I had one. I have to say, one really tasty one. Yes. It was a very floral Ethiopian.
Was it mine?
I never had a cold brew from you. Did I have? I had a nitro brew from you.
True. No, I started experimenting with cold brew in 2016. And what's also interesting, there's a lot of talk about hot or cold blooming before you add the entire amount of water. And well, it's more anecdotic. It's not a real experiment, but I felt like with a hot blooming, then step the coffee in cold water for 16 hours compared to a cold blooming. I got more of, in general speaking, fruity flavors. And when I started with a cold blooming, I had with the same coffee more like vegetable and herbal notes. That was one finding. And another finding, many cold brews I tried, they tasted already a little rancid. And you already had like those old tasty notes. And what I tried to do during the brewing, I already added or flushed the whole metal cylinder with nitrogen, so to make sure there's no oxygen involved. And then I just closed it to make sure that no volatiles will go out and so oxygen will not go in. And I left it for 16 hours under this preparation, and that helped me to avoid getting this harsh, oldish, rancid flavors.
Yeah. I think
it's actually hard with coffee, because coffee has a lot of free radicals in the ground. In the roasted bean, right? And once you brew coffee, you release those free radicals, which start to destroy your beverage. So even with nitrogen flush, if you get rid of the oxygen, you'll still have those which will work through your beverage and will degrade the taste eventually. Perhaps you just saved yourself some time by doing this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't have experience, but definitely there are. That it's a problem why these beverages were not in the market so like earlier, and why they're not so much present. It's the stability of the beverage is rather low. That's why adding milk or adding sugar to mask these flavors, right? This is the way how most commercial producers make their ready-to-drink beverages that are drank cold to mask the oxidation notes.